My parents chose my brother's birthday over my husband's death. Then came the settlement division. That sentence sounds surreal, doesn't it? But that's exactly how it happened. I wish I could say I'm exaggerating for effect, that I've bent the truth to make my story more dramatic, but I haven't. My name is Jessica Beal. I'm 39 years old, a project director at Cascade Green, an environmental conservation nonprofit based in Portland. I've always believed in quiet progress, in doing good without needing applause. My husband Ryan shared that same quiet compass. He was an environmental engineer, thoughtful to a fault, the kind of man who picked up trash on hiking trails and never left a grocery cart in the parking lot. We built a life rooted in purpose. Our daughter Lena, now 8, was born after years of trying. I had 2 miscarriages, a failed adoption match, and a diagnosis of uterine scarring that made her very existence feel like a miracle when she came. All 6 pounds of her, screaming with a tiny fist clenched around Ryan's pinky. We didn't take a single day for granted. From the outside, our life looked simple, but the complications always came from one direction: my parents. Margaret and Alan White have lived in the same suburb outside Salem for 30 years. They're the kind of couple who host neighborhood wine nights and live for HOA meetings. Their lives orbit around my younger brother Ethan, the golden child who could do no wrong. When I graduated from Stanford with distinction, they mailed a card. When Ethan passed his first real estate licensing exam, they threw him a backyard party with catering and live music. It was always like that. When Ryan and I bought our home in the city, they visited once and spent most of the afternoon asking about the market value. When Lena was born, they came after 3 weeks and stayed 20 minutes. But I kept inviting them, kept sending holiday cards, birthday gifts, updates about Lena. I told myself they just struggled to express love, that maybe I needed to work harder. It was a Wednesday afternoon when the call came. I had just wrapped a team meeting about our watershed restoration project and was about to head downstairs for coffee when my phone buzzed. Unknown number. I almost ignored it. But something told me to answer. The voice on the other end was a woman. Calm but firm. Officer Green, Portland PD. There's been a vehicle accident. Your husband Ryan didn't survive. Your daughter is in critical condition at Providence Children's Hospital. I think I sat down on the floor. I don't remember doing it. I don't remember what I said. I only remember the sterile hallway, the stale carpet smell, and my heart slamming so hard I thought it would break through my ribs. Ryan had picked up Lena early from school for the annual eco fair downtown. It was their tradition. She'd made a papier-mâché owl for the bird migration booth. I was supposed to meet them there after work. Instead, I was told a delivery truck failed to stop at a red light, T-boned Ryan's side at 47 miles per hour. He died at the scene. Lena, belted in her booster, suffered massive internal injuries, a punctured lung, and blunt force trauma to her head. At the ER, I was told she was in surgery. I sat in a beige chair, staring at the wall, clutching Ryan's jacket they'd handed me in a plastic bag. I called my parents. My mom answered, upbeat and breathless, music in the background. I told her what had happened. I told her I needed them. She paused, then she said, Jess, we're actually at Ethan's birthday dinner right now. Can this wait until later tonight? I told her Ryan was dead, that Lena might not survive. She sighed. Sweetie, this is just really bad timing. Ethan's 30 today. We rented out the patio at Bel Canto. You understand. Right. I didn't answer. There was nothing to say. By the time the call ended, something had shifted in me. Not just the weight of grief, but something deeper, A line drawn, a realization that I'd been begging people to care who never truly had. I stared at the wall for a long time, then stood up and walked back toward the surgical floor. Lena was still fighting. Ryan was gone, and my parents had just made their choice. They didn't know it yet, but that choice would be permanent. The ICU smelled like bleach and something metallic I couldn't place. Machines beeped softly, forming a mechanical rhythm that seemed to replace my own heartbeat. Lena lay motionless in the hospital bed, a child's body swallowed by wires and tubes. Her left arm was in a cast, her skull partially shaved where they'd inserted a pressure monitor. I had always imagined that if something this horrific ever happened, I would fall apart, scream, collapse to the floor, but instead, I just sat there, still, quiet, breathing because I had no choice. Dr. Cheng explained everything with careful, measured words: traumatic brain injury, swelling, a medically induced coma, to give her the best chance. There was no timeline, no guarantees. Her vitals are stable, she said, gently. That's what we hold on to for now. I nodded, pretending I understood. Though everything inside me felt fractured, I asked if I could sit with Lena during the night, and they brought me a reclining chair. I didn't sleep, just stared at the same ceiling tile for hours, waiting for something to change. Nothing did. Clara arrived the next morning. She must have driven all night. She didn't knock or ask questions. She just walked in with clean clothes, a bag of toiletries, and coffee that I couldn't drink. She called Ryan's parents, who were in their 70s and still living in Vermont. They booked a flight immediately. She called my boss, who promised bereavement leave without limits. She was calm, decisive, compassionate, the way I always imagined my mother might be if she ever tried. 2 days later, Lena made it through a second surgery. The swelling in her brain had increased, but the doctors responded quickly. I spent my days in that chair beside her, holding her hand, whispering things she couldn't hear. I told her about the trees outside the window, about her favorite stuffed frog that was waiting for her at home, about how her dad used to sing terribly off-key when washing dishes, just to make her laugh. She didn't move, but I kept talking. Michael's parents arrived worn and pale from grief and travel, but full of concern and grace. They brought me a scarf of Ryan's from their coat closet, one I hadn't seen in years. It still smelled like his cologne. They cried quietly, but they stayed. They brought soup. They took turns sitting with Lena so I could shower. They asked questions, listened closely, and didn't once mention money or logistics, just love, just presence. My own parents sent flowers, a white arrangement with a note that said, "Thinking of you. Hope she recovers soon." No phone call, no visit, no explanation. Clara raised an eyebrow when the delivery came. I just shrugged. I didn't have the energy to dissect their silence. Maybe I already knew what it meant. Planning Ryan's funeral felt like organizing a wedding backwards. I booked the crematorium from the hospital hallway. I asked a local pastor to officiate. I wrote his obituary between blood test updates and neurology rounds. He had built solar irrigation systems in Malawi, cleaned beaches in Costa Rica, helped design wildlife-safe bridges for deer migration across Oregon highways. I couldn't reduce his life to 3 paragraphs, but I tried. I didn't want Lena to wake up one day and wonder why no one had honored him properly. 3 days before the funeral, my mother finally called. Her tone was light. We were going to check in, but Ethan had an issue with his housing lease, and it's been a whole thing. I said nothing. She asked when the funeral was. I told her. Her voice shifted slightly. That's a little tricky. Ethan has a client brunch at noon and a networking event in the evening. Any way you could reschedule to morning? I didn't yell. I didn't cry. I just said no and ended the call. The day of the funeral, I left the hospital for the first time in over a week. Lena was stable. The nurses promised to call if anything changed. I wore a simple black dress and borrowed shoes from Clara. The service was held at a community chapel filled with colleagues, volunteers, and neighbors who had known Ryan through his work. People shared stories about his gentleness, his humor, his stubborn optimism. I stood at the podium and tried to speak like he would have wanted, honest, clear, human. My parents arrived 17 minutes late, walking in mid-hymn with Ethan in tow. My mother looked polished, dressed like she was attending a civic luncheon. My father sat stiffly, checking his watch more than once. Ethan looked like he wanted to disappear. They said nothing as I delivered the eulogy, and they left before the final song ended. Clara told me later that my mother said they had another engagement and couldn't linger. That night, I returned to Lena's bedside and held her small hand while machines kept her alive. I whispered to her the same promise I made silently at Ryan's grave. The days in the ICU had stopped following any calendar. Time was no longer measured in hours or dates, but in beeping rhythms, shift changes, and the patterns on the heart monitor. Lena lay motionless beneath pale hospital sheets, her small body wrapped in gauze and wires, her head bandaged from the pressure probe inserted during emergency surgery. Each morning, Dr. Cheng arrived just after 7, her voice calm and clinical, delivering updates that were equal parts hope and caution. She said Lena's intracranial pressure had begun to stabilize and that they would continue monitoring brainstem responses. I nodded, absorbing every word, not because I fully understood them, but because it gave my mind something to hold on to. Outside the windows, I saw weather change, clouds pass, but inside that room, everything was susp. Clara came often, always bringing fresh clothes, small snacks I rarely touched, and picture books that Lena had loved before the accident. She rearranged the cards on the bulletin board and taped up drawings sent by classmates. She placed a framed photo of Ryan on the nightstand and whispered goodnight to Lena like it was second nature. Some evenings, we played the playlist Ryan had curated for their morning drives. Acoustic guitar, soft vocals, songs he said made the world feel light. On the 12th night, something changed. I was halfway through the same mystery chapter I had read every day when Lena's left hand moved, not a twitch, a slow, controlled clench of her fingers. I stared in silence, then hit the call button for Nurse Kelly. She examined Lena's pupils, checked her reflexes, then looked at me and said, "This isn't involuntary. She's initiating it. She's coming back." My heart didn't race, and I didn't cry. I just sat down, held her hand again, and waited for it to happen a second time. It did. 3 minutes later, that night, her eyelids flickered briefly. It was the most beautiful, terrifying thing I'd seen. The next morning, I made a decision I wasn't sure I'd regret. I called my parents. My father answered and passed the phone to my mother without speaking. I told her Lena had shown signs of waking, that she was responding. My mother paused, then shifted into a tone I recognized far too well. "That's wonderful news," she said, her voice warm and oddly calculated. "And has anything come back from the legal side?" About the driver's insurance, I didn't answer. She filled the silence. Your father has been doing some research. In cases like this, settlements can be substantial, especially with a child involved. I ended the call without replying. Later that day, Harold Brennan arrived at the hospital. Clara had found him through a nonprofit legal aid network. His suit was rumpled, his briefcase worn, but everything about him felt steady. He explained that the driver had a prior DUI, that the trucking company had already been contacted, and that a settlement would likely come quickly. They want it quiet, he said, and you have every right to make sure Lena's care is fully funded for as long as she needs it. He explained trust structures, long-term planning, and lifetime medical considerations. I nodded, took the paperwork, and tried to stay focused. Harold didn't ask me to hurry, he said. You stay with her. I'll handle everything else. The next day, my parents arrived without warning. They brought a panda plush and a helium balloon that said, "Get well soon," in a font that belonged on party invitations. My mother wore a crisp blazer, full makeup, and the kind of necklace she saved for country club luncheons. My father held a thick folder and stayed 3 steps behind her as she approached Lena's bed. Lena's fingers had started moving more frequently, small responses that Dr. Chung called encouraging. My mother smiled as she looked down at her granddaughter, brushing a loose curl from Lena's forehead. "You'll be back to school before you know it," she whispered. Her voice was sweet, but off-key, like someone practicing kindness for the first time. My father lingered by the small table near the window, placed the folder on its surface, and cleared his throat. We thought we'd come by, check in, and offer some help. Now that the legal side is progressing, he glanced at the folder, as if it might speak for him. There's a lot to consider. It affects all of us. I looked at Lena, who hadn't opened her eyes yet, but whose monitors began to rise just slightly. A few minutes later, her fingers moved again, a slow, deliberate curl of the hand. I didn't need a medical explanation. I knew exactly what she was reacting to. My mother sat straighter, trying to regain her tone. Your father and I believe we should talk through options. This settlement, it's significant, and we think it would be wise to plan for the entire family's future, not just medical costs. I didn't respond. I just turned toward Lena and pressed her hand gently. She moved again. Her heartbeat ticked upward. She felt it too, even in that state. She could sense exactly what was real and what was not. They didn't come for Lena. They came for the money, and they didn't even realize she already knew. The visit ended with an awkward silence that my parents pretended not to notice. My mother gave Lena a peck on the forehead as if she had earned that gesture, then turned to me and said they'd be in touch soon to finalize a few things. I didn't ask what those things were. I already knew. As they walked out of the room, I sat beside Lena, watching the numbers on her monitor slowly settle back to baseline. Her fingers stopped twitching. Her body calmed. I leaned in close and whispered that she was safe now, that no one would take anything from her again, not even a moment like this. That evening, I called Clara and told her exactly what had happened. She was quiet for a long time, then finally said, "Jess, they're circling. You're going to have to be ready." I knew she was right. The next morning, I found the folder my father had left. Curiosity got the better of me. I opened it slowly, expecting legal notes or financial spreadsheets. But what I found was worse. Printed articles about wrongful death settlements, a mock breakdown of family allocation, even a typed letter drafted to a lawyer unsigned but clearly prepared to be sent. One line had been highlighted in yellow, "Given the nature of our blood relation and emotional investment, we believe we are entitled to a portion, That phrase clung to my chest like a bruise. I placed the folder in a locked cabinet in my apartment and didn't speak to them for a week. During that time, Lena's responses grew more frequent. She opened her eyes for the first time on a Wednesday afternoon, just for a few seconds, but it was enough to stop my breath. Dr. Chang called it a pivotal step. Lena blinked once when I said her name. She tried to move her head when Clara entered the room. The next morning, she squeezed my hand once for yes and twice for no. The system wasn't perfect, but it gave us something. I asked if she was cold, if she was scared, if she knew where she was. She responded each time with clarity. When I asked if she remembered the accident, she squeezed twice. No. I let out a breath I didn't know I'd been holding. Harold returned later that week with updates. The trucking company had formally offered a settlement 7 figures, structured across multiple disbursements, with a significant portion locked in a medical trust. He said the terms were strong and protected Lena's care well into adulthood. I asked about taxes, investment growth, long-term oversight. He said he'd bring in a financial advisor specialized in special needs planning. You're doing everything right. He told me as I signed the first round of paperwork, Ryan would be proud. I nodded but didn't speak. There was something heavy about making decisions like this alone, something hollow, even when the outcome was necessary. That night, my parents called again. My mother's voice was unusually cheerful, as if nothing awkward had ever occurred. Your father and I were thinking we should drop by the house this weekend. It might be easier to talk through everything in a quieter setting, less emotional. I almost laughed. You mean without Lena there, I said flatly. She paused, then replied, It's just easier to discuss things calmly when we're not in a hospital. I agreed to the visit, not because I wanted it, but because I knew I had to stop pretending this was just a misunderstanding. The sooner they said what they came to say, the sooner I could deal with it on record. They arrived Saturday evening at exactly 7. Ethan came too, though he looked uncomfortable the entire time. Clara offered to stay with Lena while I handled it alone. I made tea, set out cookies no one would eat, and invited them into the living room. My parents sat like they had rehearsed this, my mother crossing her legs, my father resting a thick manila envelope on his lap. Ethan hovered near the edge of a chair like he might vanish if he sat fully down. Jess. My mother began with a tight smile. We've been thinking a lot about what's best for everyone. This settlement changes things. It's bigger than just one person's tragedy. It affects the family. I didn't say anything. I just waited. My father leaned forward and opened the envelope. Inside were typed proposals, numbered bullet points, and a breakdown of how the money should be reasonably distributed. 50% for Lena's care, the other 50% split between family needs, including a proposed investment in Ethan's new startup and a retirement plan for my parents. They had labeled it a restorative approach for communal healing. The audacity made my hands shake. I set down my cup and looked at each of them, one by one. And what about Ryan's parents, I asked. Are they included in this communal healing? My mother's face changed. Well, they're not blood, she said, her voice tightening. This is about legacy, our legacy. That word echoed in my head for a long moment. I stood up, walked down the hallway to my bedroom, and retrieved a photo album I had been quietly building for Lena. I chose 2 pictures and brought them back. The first was of Ryan in the hospital morgue. His face was peaceful but clearly lifeless. The second was of Lena in ICU, unconscious and swollen, her face barely recognizable. I placed them gently on the coffee table. My mother gasped. My father looked away. Ethan closed his eyes. They didn't speak after I placed the photos on the table, not right away. My mother stared at the image of Ryan with the kind of discomfort you reserve for something you didn't expect to see and couldn't explain away. My father's face went pale, his posture stiff, but he didn't look away from Lena's photo, the one where she was unconscious, swollen, and bruised beyond recognition. Ethan didn't move. He sat there frozen, hands clenched, eyes lowered like a boy being scolded in a room he no longer wanted to be in. I waited, not to hurt them, not to make a point, but to make them see what this cost. What they had tried to carve up like a financial asset was in fact a grave and a child barely clinging to life. When I finally spoke, my voice was even and quiet. This is what you're calling a resource. This is what you're trying to split. My mother opened her mouth, but didn't speak. She had no script for this moment. I picked up the envelope of proposed percentages and placed it on top of the photographs without looking at it. There will be no division. There will be no family redistribution. Every dollar from the settlement is going where it belongs, Lena's care, Lena's future, and only that. My father tried to say something about fairness, something about how families should support each other in hardship. I looked directly at him and said, "You weren't there during the hardship. You weren't there when I picked out Ryan's casket while holding Lena's hand in ICU. You weren't there when she coded on the third night and I didn't know if she'd wake up. You can't support something you abandoned." My mother's composure cracked, but not with regret. She stood up, gathered her purse, and said coldly, "You'll regret this one day. Jessica, you'll realize you needed us." I didn't flinch. I said, "Maybe, but I'd rather need help than sell my daughter's trauma for it." They left. Ethan lingered for a moment longer, eyes still low. I didn't know they were going to ask for that much. He mumbled. I said nothing. He nodded once, then walked out after them. The silence that followed was a relief. Not peace exactly, but space. Space to breathe, space to think. That night, I sat beside Lena's bed and watched her sleep, her vitals steady, her breath slow and deep. I brushed her hair back from her forehead and whispered, "They won't come back. But it's okay. We don't need that kind of family." Over the next 2 weeks, Lena's speech began to return in fragments. Her words were slow at first, shaped by effort and therapy. But they came. She asked about the Owl Project, the one she was going to present at the Eco Fair. She asked where Daddy was. I told her the truth, gently, clearly. And when the tears came, I held her and said, "He would be here if he could, and he'd be so proud of you right now." She nodded and didn't ask again. Some part of her understood what even grown-ups often don't, that loss isn't just a fact. It's a presence that lingers, silent but real. Harold finalized the settlement. The trust was locked, layered with protection so even I couldn't touch it outside of medical needs and education costs. He introduced me to a financial advisor who specialized in long-term care plans for minors with TBI recovery. Every decision was made with Lena's future in mind, not convenience, not comfort. I went back to work part-time, remote for now, slowly reintegrating into a life that no longer looked like the one I had built with Ryan. My days became a rhythm of therapy appointments, work meetings, insurance documentation, and evening books read aloud beside a hospital bed. It was exhausting, but it was movement. Movement was everything. Michael's parents flew in again for a long weekend. They didn't come with questions or offers. They came with soup, stories, and time. They brought Lena a stuffed seahorse and showed her pictures of her dad at her age, including one where he wore the same concentrated frown she made when learning to walk again. They sat with me at night, asked if I was sleeping, asked if I needed anything. They were grieving too, but they knew how to love through it. That's what made the difference. Not what they said, just that they stayed. One evening after Lena's session, we sat on the hospital patio where patients could get some sunlight. She looked up from her coloring book and said, "Is it just going to be you and me?" Now I thought about how to answer without sounding dramatic or dishonest. Then I said, "Mostly. Yes, but we have help. Clara, Grandpa Tom, Grandma Helen, your teachers, good people who care." Lena nodded slowly, taking that in. Then she said, "Okay, I think we can do that." Her hand slipped into mine, and we watched the clouds drift quietly overhead. The turning point didn't come with fanfare. It came on a Monday morning when I walked into Lena's therapy room and saw her standing for 3 seconds without assistance. No applause, no music, just the quiet shift of weight and a small smile between her and the therapist. But I knew something had changed. Her balance wasn't perfect, and her legs still shook slightly, but the determination in her face was something I hadn't seen in months. That look reminded me of Ryan Calm Focus. No need for attention, just progress made in silence. Later that evening, as she rested on the couch with a hot water bottle over her hip, I asked if she was tired. She nodded and said, "But I'm not stopping." I told her she didn't have to. We were moving forward at her pace, and in my mind, I realized that so was I. The more stable Lena became, the more I began to notice how fractured everything else had been. I saw how I had stretched myself thin for years, trying to earn my family's approval, trying to turn their emotional absence into something meaningful. I saw how I made space in my life for people who never made space for me, in the quiet that followed their departure. I didn't just feel sadness. I felt freedom. There were no more polite invitations, no more long drives to birthday dinners where I played second to Ethan's latest real estate story. There were no more explanations, no more hope for recognition, and that, surprisingly, gave me room to rebuild on my own terms. Work resumed in slow waves. My director allowed me to lead a smaller sustainability campaign for urban pollination corridors, and I found a strange comfort in spreadsheets, progress metrics, and meeting agendas. It was technical, measurable, and stable, everything that grief was not. Some afternoons, I'd step out of my home office and sit on the porch with a cup of tea, just watching the wind pass through the trees. It wasn't healing in the dramatic sense, but it was a rhythm. My therapist called it repatterning, the process of replacing chaos with structure, even if that structure was as simple as checking the mail and watering the plants. Lena's care plan was improving. Her vocabulary came back stronger, her short-term memory more intact. She could count to 30 again. She remembered Ryan's favorite pizza order. She smiled more. These were the milestones that made all the paperwork, all the exhaustion, all the nights of doubt worth it. One day, an envelope arrived without a return address. Inside was a folded sheet of printer paper with one sentence typed across the middle. "Families don't give up on each other." No signature, no name, just that. I stared at it for a long time. It could have been my mother. It could have been Ethan. Maybe it was both. But I didn't respond. I didn't need to. Words don't overwrite actions. And after everything that had happened, I'd learned that not every bridge was meant to be rebuilt. Sometimes survival meant walking forward without looking back. I folded the paper again, placed it in the shredder, and went to prepare Lena's afternoon snack. Clara stayed with us through the spring, and her presence helped normalize our days. She wasn't intrusive or overly sentimental. She helped Lena with puzzles, made a point to include her in household decisions, and offered me space when I needed to breathe. She told me one evening, over dish drying, that what my parents had done wasn't just cruel. It was cowardly. It's easier to demand something than to show up when it counts. She said. I nodded, grateful not just for her insight, but for her loyalty. She wasn't family by blood, but she was there, present, involved. That counted more. The only time I saw Ethan again was at the grocery store in late May. He was in the self-checkout line, scanning a bottle of wine and a box of frozen lasagna. When he looked up and saw me, he paused, unsure whether to approach. He finally walked over, hands in his pockets, and asked how Lena was doing. I gave him the basic facts. She was progressing. She was tough. He nodded and looked down, then said, I'm sorry I didn't do more. I should have told them to stop. I didn't say anything for a moment. Then I said, you had a choice. You still do. He nodded again, but didn't respond. That was the end of it. We went separate ways, both of us knowing that some things, once broken, can't be pieced back without leaving the cracks exposed. That night, as Lena fell asleep listening to an audiobook, I sat beside her bed and felt something I hadn't in a long time. Not relief, not happiness, just strength. Quiet, solid strength. The kind you build slowly, step by step. When no one is watching, I didn't know what the next year would look like, but I knew this much. We were still standing, and that was enough for now. Summer brought small victories. Lena no longer needed help brushing her teeth, and she insisted on tying her own shoes, even if it took a few extra minutes. Her physical therapist, a soft-spoken man named Rafi, told me she was progressing faster than most kids in her condition. I didn't ask for comparisons. I had learned by now that healing wasn't a race, but I kept track of the details that mattered. She laughed more. She started drawing again. Her legs no longer trembled when she climbed stairs. The drawings were simple houses, trees, a girl with brown hair and purple shoes, but there was one that stopped me cold. It was of our old car, the one from the accident. Inside were 3 stick figures. One had X's for eyes. The one with brown hair was crying, and the third, the smallest, had a heart drawn on her shirt. Lena had written one word beneath the picture in block letters. After. I didn't ask what it meant. I just hugged her a little longer that night before bed. Work asked if I wanted to present at the Fall Summit in Denver. It was a big opportunity, the kind I would have jumped at years ago. But something in me hesitated. I wasn't the same strategist I had been before the accident. I wasn't interested in clapping rooms and LinkedIn sound bites. I wanted to build things that mattered, quietly, solidly. So I asked if I could instead lead a pilot program for community resilience through nature design. It wasn't glamorous, but it was real. They said yes. I started drafting outlines at the kitchen table. Lena beside me doing. Clara eventually took a job in Portland. And while we missed her, I knew it was time for the house to belong to just us again. We had our own rhythm now. Grocery runs, meal prep, walks in the park, occasional doctor visits. We weren't thriving, not in the way social media defines it, but we were grounded. I had traded ambition for stability, speed for presence, and for the first time in years, I wasn't measuring my worth by milestones other people recognized. I was measuring it by how often Lena smiled without being prompted, by how many nights we got through without nightmares, by how steady my own breathing became when I realized we had made it through another week. One Sunday, as we were folding laundry, Lena asked if she could write to her grandparents, not mine, Ryan's. I said, of course. She wrote a short note on pink paper that said she missed them and hoped they were happy. She drew a seahorse in the corner and signed her name in bubble letters. We mailed it together the next day, a week later. Helen and Tom sent back a letter with a pressed flower, an old photo of Ryan as a child, and a note saying how proud they were of both of us. They said they would always be here, no matter the distance. I cried that night not out of grief, but because I finally understood what it meant to be loved without needing to earn it. Then came the call I didn't expect. A legal firm representing my parents reached out, not directly, but through formal notice. They wanted mediation, not for money, they claimed, but for closure. I didn't answer, not out of spite, but because I didn't owe them the ending they wanted. Sometimes closure doesn't come in a room with paperwork and apologies. Sometimes it comes quietly, on a Tuesday afternoon, when you realize you no longer hope someone will call, and you feel peace instead of disappointment. That was the kind of ending I wanted. Quiet, clean, without drama. The project I proposed finally launched in September. It involved building micro-green spaces in economically fragile neighborhoods, especially schools. We partnered with teachers, local councils, and even a few artists. I took Lena with me to one of the sites. She wore her purple shoes and carried a clipboard like she was running the show. One of the volunteers asked if she was my intern. She looked up and said, "I'm the boss's boss." Everyone laughed. And in that moment, I realized I hadn't just rebuilt my career. I had rebuilt my center, not around revenge, not around validation, but around clarity, around truth. That night, Lena fell asleep on the couch, her head on my lap, a light blanket over her legs. I watched the slow rise and fall of her chest and thought about how everything had broken once, clean and sudden, but it hadn't ended there. It had stretched into something new, not better, not worse, just different and more honest. And that honesty, I knew, would carry us further than anything ambition ever had. It wasn't until Lena's school sent home a permission slip for their family participation week that I realized how far we had come. It wasn't that I hadn't noticed the quiet changes I had. She no longer asked about her dad with a trembling voice. She could walk half a block on her own. Her laughter returned in full color. But something about that little sheet of paper, with its cheerful font and clip art of smiling stick families, made me pause. It was one of those reminders that the world kept moving, with or without you, and that you had to decide when to rejoin. I filled out the form, checked the box for parent volunteer, and made a mental note to buy snacks for the class. I didn't overthink it. I just showed up. When I arrived at the school that morning, Lena introduced me to her teacher as the strongest woman in the world. I didn't cry. I just smiled and shook the teacher's hand. That day, we painted birdhouses and sorted picture books for the library. Lena worked beside me with quiet focus, pausing now and then to check if I needed help. Other parents were there too. Some asked about my work. One recognized my name from an article in a local journal and asked if I was the green space strategist. I nodded. That was all. There was no need to elaborate. My identity no longer needed to be explained to fit into someone else's framework. I was her mother. I was rebuilding. That was enough. Later that week, I received a formal email from the estate lawyer who had handled Ryan's case. The message was short. My parents had requested a settlement review, not the emotional kind, the financial one, apparently, after Ryan's passing. An insurance disbursement had inadvertently named me sole beneficiary of a parcel of land my grandfather once owned. Land my parents assumed would go to Ethan. It had been left untouched in the records for years, but now that it held development value, they wanted it back. The irony didn't escape me. They couldn't attend Ryan's funeral, couldn't bring themselves to support Lena's recovery, but suddenly, they were ready to meet over contracts. I called my lawyer, not out of fear, but to ensure clarity. We reviewed the original documents. Everything was airtight. I hadn't taken anything from anyone. What they had expected was entitlement. What they found was a legal line they couldn't cross. The decision wasn't difficult. I kept the land, but I didn't sell it. Instead, I proposed a partnership with the city to turn it into a rehabilitation-friendly park, the kind with sensory paths, adaptive playgrounds, shaded benches, and communal gardens. I named it the Lena Grove Project. It wasn't revenge. It was reclamation, a way to take something that had been marked by greed and turn it into healing. News traveled quickly in our small circles. My mother didn't call. My father didn't write. But Ethan sent a text. 3 words. You really did. I didn't respond. I didn't need to. The message wasn't an apology. It was an admission. Quiet. Late. But clear. He had watched me walk away. Watched me carry my child alone. And now he watched the very thing they had overlooked become something permanent, visible, public. There was no gloating in my chest, only stillness, the kind that comes when you've lived through a storm and realized you don't need the people who left you in the rain. On the day the city broke ground for the Lena Grove project, I stood quietly near the back of the crowd, Lena by my side in her purple jacket, hair tied back in a neat braid. The mayor spoke. The local paper took photos. Volunteers passed out seed packets. I didn't take the microphone. I didn't need to explain the story behind the space. It was already written into every corner of the design: accessibility, openness, resilience. That was the story now, afterward. Lena tugged my hand and said she wanted to plant the first tree. We walked to the marked spot, knelt together, and placed the sapling gently into the soil. No one clapped, no speeches, just a mother and daughter, building something out of loss. That night, after Lena had gone to bed, I sat on the porch and listened to the wind again. It was colder now, hinting at the coming fall. I thought of everything we had lost, everything we had survived, and the strange, quiet power that comes from having nothing left to prove. I wasn't angry anymore. I wasn't searching for recognition. I was simply rooted, like that tree, growing quietly in soil others had tried to claim. And for the first time in a long while, I slept without waking. A few months after the Lena Grove project opened to the public, I received a letter in the mail that didn't have a return address. I almost tossed it aside, assuming it was another generic fundraiser or political flyer. But when I opened it, the handwriting inside was unmistakably my mother's. It wasn't an apology. Not really. There were no sentences like, "I'm sorry for what we did," or "I regret choosing Ethan's birthday over Ryan's funeral." Instead, it was a letter filled with questions that hinted at confusion more than remorse. "Why didn't you say anything sooner?" she wrote. "You always had a way of disappearing into silence when it mattered." I read that line twice, then folded the letter slowly and placed it back into the envelope without responding. It wasn't worth correcting her version of the past. She hadn't noticed my silence when I needed help, when I begged for support through subtle glances and voiceless pain. She only noticed now that her grip on control was gone. I didn't respond because I had nothing left to give her that wouldn't cost me more than it was worth. That was the shift. The moment you realize peace isn't always found in confrontation or clarity. Sometimes peace is in knowing you no longer owe anyone an explanation for choosing yourself. For the first time in my life, I wasn't living in reaction to my family's approval or rejection. I had stepped out of the cycle, and it was quiet here. Not lonely, just still. Lena began to flourish in ways that startled me. She developed a love for sketching, particularly trees. She'd come home from school and sit on the floor of our little living room, tracing roots and branches with such focus that I often forgot the weight we had both carried. One afternoon, she held up a drawing and said, "This is us. We're like this tree. You can't see how deep the roots go, but they're strong." I don't think she meant it to be profound, but it stayed with me. The strongest parts of our story were the parts no one could see. That winter, I received an invitation from a regional urban design conference. They wanted me to speak about sustainable development, not because of my resume or connections, but because someone had walked through Lena Grove and recommended me anonymously. I accepted. It was the first time I had spoken publicly since Ryan's death. I didn't mention his name on stage. I didn't mention my family. I talked about rebuilding from constraint, about how design wasn't just about beauty or cost, it was about care, about imagining something better even when no one else saw the value in it. The applause at the end wasn't loud, but it was respectful. And when I stepped down from the podium, a younger woman approached and said, "Your story is the reason I'm still in this field." Thank you. That was enough. I didn't need anything louder. A week later, I passed by Ethan's business downtown. The lights were dim. A handwritten sign on the door read, "Closed for restructuring." I kept walking. I didn't feel satisfaction, only understanding. Cycles end. Not because someone loses or someone wins, but because energy eventually returns to its source. The choices we make echo, sometimes for years, sometimes in ways we can't anticipate. Ethan would rebuild, maybe, or maybe he wouldn't. That wasn't mine to carry anymore. I had carried too much that didn't belong to me. One evening, Lena asked if we could visit the Grove after dinner. It was cold, but I said yes. We walked in silence until we reached the bench near the first tree she had planted. She sat, pulled her knees to her chest, and said, "I used to wish we were a normal family, but now I'm kind of glad we're not." I asked why. She looked up at the branches above and said, "Because normal people don't know how strong they are until something hard happens. We already know." I didn't speak. I just placed my hand gently over hers. That was our closure. Not a confrontation, not a dramatic reunion, just a child and her mother, learning to live in truth. That night, I didn't check my phone for texts from family. I didn't reread old messages or wonder if they'd come around. I tucked Lena into bed, cleaned up the kitchen, and stood by the window with a cup of tea. The world outside was quiet, blanketed in snow. The house was warm, not big, not filled with expensive things, but filled with safety, with clarity, with intention. I had built a life from the rubble, not by fighting for approval, but by releasing it entirely. It hadn't been easy, but it was mine. Spring came back around like it always did. But this time, it didn't feel like a reminder of what I had lost. It felt like a quiet reward for everything I had endured. Lena was 13 now, taller and sharper than ever, and the community project we started a year ago had finally become a fully operational garden space, community kitchen, and support hub most days. I didn't even have to be there anymore. The people had taken ownership of it, and that was the point all along. Leadership wasn't about controlling the outcome. It was about making sure others believed they could shape it themselves. One afternoon, while organizing our shared book corner inside the community library room, I noticed Lena quietly replacing a cracked tile at the entrance. No one had asked her to. She just noticed it, found a solution, and did it. That was the moment I realized something had shifted for good. Not just in her, but in me too. I was no longer rebuilding myself from pain. I was building forward from peace. The surprise came in a letter, a formal one, printed on cream paper, signed in ink. My parents were dividing what remained of the family estate and wanted to include me fairly. Their words, not mine. I reread the phrase for the sake of legacy 3 times before putting it down. Legacy had become a strange word in my world. It used to mean inheritance, influence, control. Now, it meant who showed up when no one was watching, what you stood for when you had nothing left to prove. I didn't respond to the letter immediately. I wanted to be sure I wasn't reacting from ego or habit. I let it sit there, unopened for 2 more weeks. By then, Lena had read the outside and asked, "Are you going to take it?" I told her I wasn't sure yet. She nodded like she understood more than I had explained. The truth was, they weren't offering peace. They were offering paperwork, a tidy close to a messy past. But the story didn't belong to them anymore. They had left it long ago. They were visitors now, not architects. I eventually replied with one line: I no longer wish to be part of this division. I've already claimed what matters to me. I didn't expect a reply. I didn't need one. The closure wasn't in their answer. It was in the fact that I no longer needed their validation. Not for Lena, not for my work, not for the version of myself I had spent so long restoring. A week later, a reporter from a local paper requested an interview for a feature called Women Who Rebuilt. I hesitated. I didn't want to turn grief into a headline. But she said, "Your name keeps coming up not because of your history, but because of how you lead now." So I sat down with her and told the story as it happened, without drama, without edits, without erasing the parts that hurt. When the article came out, Lena clipped the print version and framed it. She placed it on our hallway wall next to Ryan's favorite quote, the one we had carved into a bench at the community grove. It read, "Build the kind of silence that feeds the soil, not the noise that demands a crowd." That sentence had carried me further than any apology ever could, because in the end, the story wasn't about revenge. It wasn't even about justice. It was about clarity, about not confusing pain with purpose or power with healing. My parents had chosen absence when presence mattered. My brother had chosen celebration when mourning was needed. And I had chosen stillness when noise could have been easier. We all made choices, but only some of us stayed when it cost us everything. Now, when people ask why I never went back, why I never fought harder for what I was owed, I simply say this: what I have now isn't owed, it's earned, and I built it without permission. My name may never appear in some family trust or photo frame at their house, but my daughter knows what resilience looks like. My community knows what dignity feels like. And I know, finally, what it means to walk away and not leave anything unfinished. So maybe the better question isn't why I let go. Maybe the better question is, what would you build if you stopped waiting to be chosen?